Just preparing the YouTube stream. Okay, fantastic. See some familiar faces, and well, not faces, but names there in the chat window. Exciting to see everybody here this afternoon. And I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to click on the record button. So we'll go ahead and get going here. Hello and welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you here this afternoon for this very important event. This webinar brought to you by the Southern Conference on Language Teaching. My name is Bobby Hobgood, and I'm honored to serve as president of SCOLT for the next couple of years. On behalf of our board of directors, we are excited and glad that you are here. We are very honored and excited to have this distinguished panel who's going to share with you their research and their experience related to a number of topics that I think are very important and very timely for us right now in the country. Today's panel presentation is an extension of our statement of solidarity, and I want to share briefly with you that statement. We're not going to look at the entire statement, but in particular, the second or third paragraph down, in which we encourage all teachers to be intentional and reflective in addressing issues of social justice. We at SCOLT are committed to helping teachers make a difference in the lives of their students, and as such, we recommend these resources that we're going to share with you at the end of our session. Also, our panelists have agreed to share with you some of the content and information from their presentations, not their slides per se, but the content itself. And so we'll direct you all where that information is located, as well as an archived recording of today's presentation. Okay. So in terms of our session today, I want to first introduce our speakers. Next, our first speaker, Dr. Randolph, will deliver his presentation, followed by Dr. Heinz Gaither, then Dr. Johnson, and then we'll finish up with a 10-minute question and answer session. In terms of protocol for today, you'll notice that you do not have access to your webcam or your microphone. You can't raise your hand because we have such large numbers of folks who have registered for this event. We felt that it made sense logistically to eliminate those traps, which as language teachers we can fall into if we all get involved in this conversation. So we'd ask that instead you post your questions in the Q&A window, and then any comments in the chat window. At the end of our panelist presentations, we'll have the 10-minute Q&A, and our executive director, Leslie Baldwin, will field questions from that Q&A to our panelists. And then our social media person, Heidi Trude, will do the same for the chat window in the YouTube live stream. If your question is not answered today, our panelists have graciously agreed to respond to any of those questions. We will also make those available via the SCOLT website. And finally, information about CEUs will be sent to all Zoom attendees who attended the entire session via email. So we'll take a look at the end of the session to see if you attended the entire session, and we'll send you information about the CEUs. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing my video and now want to move on and introduce our speakers this afternoon. Dr. L.J. Randolph is an associate professor of Spanish and education and the coordinator of the World Language Teacher Education Program at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He teaches courses in Spanish language, contemporary Latinx cultures, and second language teaching methods. His research focuses on a variety of critical issues in language education, including the teaching of Spanish to heritage and native speakers, and the incorporation of social justice-oriented pedagogy. He is a past president of the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina and currently serves on the board of directors for the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. For his segment of this afternoon's webinar, Dr. Randolph will lead us in a reflective journey in which we consider how we might be more intentional and courageous with implementing social justice-oriented curricular goals and instructional design. Dr. Krishana Hines-Gaither serves as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Director of the Intercultural Engagement Center at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. She's taught Spanish, race and ethnicity studies, women and gender studies, and Afro-Latin American studies. She is also a past president of the Foreign Language Association of North Carolina. She is the past chair of the ACTFL SIG for Educators of African American Students, and she co-founded African American Linguist. In the context of recent events such as police brutality, Dr. Hines-Gaither will offer educators tips and resources for incorporating difficult content. She will demonstrate how the World Language Classroom can serve as a culturally relevant space during these challenging times. Our third panelist is Dr. Stacy Margarita Johnson. Dr. Johnson is Assistant Director at the Center for Teaching, a senior lecturer in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and affiliated faculty in the Center for Second Language Studies at Vanderbilt University. She is also the editor of the journal Spanish and Portuguese Review and producer and host of the podcast We Teach Languages. Her research focuses on classroom practices, adult learning, critical pedagogy, and technology in language teaching. According to Dr. Johnson, courageous classrooms require students to think more clearly, critically, and intentionally. During her segment, Dr. Johnson will discuss classroom practices rooted in critical reflection and transformative learning that support the kinds of learning described by both Dr. Hines-Gaither and Dr. Randolph. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen and turn the floor over to Dr. L.J. Randolph. Dr. Randolph.
Yes, can everybody hear me? Am I?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. And I am sharing my screen right now, so hopefully that's also working.
Excellent, yes.
Great. Well, hi everyone. I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation and to be able to share with you a little bit about intentional instructional design. My portion of this talk is going to touch on more general themes of approaches to curriculum development. I think it really will help set the stage for what Krishana and Stacy will talk about. I want to start by showing this tweet. When I saw it, it caught my eye and maybe reflect a little bit. You can see the tweet itself says, professors need to prepare themselves to discuss concepts like structural racism with their students this fall, talking about fall 2020. And on the one hand, I thought, you know, that's great. We need to normalize discussions on race more. But on the other hand, I often find myself having conversations with people about race, and images of some of these people who shall remain nameless started to flash through my mind. And I was thinking to myself, oh no, please do not let this person facilitate a conversation about race with anyone, much less with students. Um, so it's great that we're in this moment where there's this push and motivation for instructors to include these topics. But I do want to caution us that our first time unpacking these issues probably shouldn't happen in front of a classroom where we're viewed as the instructional leader. So I want you to think about what do we need? What do we need at this moment to meet students and really society where they are? And there are a few perspectives and attitudes that I think we should embrace as we think about incorporating things of anti-racist work in our instructional design. Um, and the first thing that comes to mind is to just be intentional. These conversations, this type of curriculum does not happen haphazardly. It has to be purposeful, and it takes planning and forethought. Um, be self-reflective, constantly checking our own privilege and the way that we may unknowingly or inadvertently perpetuate racism in our classes. And then finally, be humble. I think even if you are someone who knows a lot about the theoretical implications and the history and the societal implications of racism and related themes, you may still not have the richness of lived experiences that your students have when it comes to certain issues. So in many ways, our students may be more of the experts in some of these areas than we ourselves are. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And here are some important resources that I think will help us to get started with that conversation or to get started with that type of instructional design. As Bobby mentioned, we'll share some of our slides or our resources with you. In my case, a few of my slides are interactive, and you can just click on the link or the picture or the book title, and it'll take you to a page where you can access more information. Um, I know that many of us are familiar with Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I saw that there's um, uh, a Facebook group or something where there's going to be a book discussion coming up with the anti-racist teacher. That that workbook was initially written for reading instruction, but I've learned so much from it relating to language instruction. And I saw also that coming up in early July, there's going to be a free webinar for teachers to engage further with that text. So I think it's important to critically engage and to question and to discuss texts like these with our colleagues. So that's just kind of my introduction. Now, who is this presentation for? I got to tell you, it was difficult to come up with what I was going to talk about in just 15 minutes with such a broad audience. We all teach in different instructional contexts. We have people here who teach a variety of languages in a variety of communities, and then across various levels in the educational spectrum from pre-K all the way up to the graduate level. And so we also have different levels of instructional autonomy. I know some teachers who have to teach the same lesson as every other teacher of that same level on any given day. And then I know in other contexts, which this describes my context, where we have a textbook that's shared among all teachers of a certain level, but how we implement those curriculum materials, that we do have the freedom to decide that. And then there are people who are able to choose their curriculum materials and the way that they will implement those curriculum materials. And so they have curricular freedom. And I put freedom in parentheses, in quotation marks, because you're still bound by the institutional culture, policies, and politics. So it's not completely free. And so what I want you to do is I invite you to reflect with me a little bit, thinking about how I can make my time meaningful here in this short period of time. I just want you to reflect with me. So this is going to be more of a reflect with me than a how to. So I hope you're okay with that. I want to start by talking about my own schooling. This is me with my high school Spanish teacher, Senorita Gullion at the time. And I was a successful learner. I obviously I became a Spanish teacher. However, when I think about not just Spanish class, but my entire experience, my schooling experience, I can't say that it was a liberating process. It was a conforming process. And for a lot of my friends and family members, cousins, etc., who looked like me and who wanted and even demanded to be more liberated in that school space, they were not rewarded for that behavior. They were often punished or ignored by the institution. And the wild thing is now that I'm a teacher, and even when I taught high school for about 10 years. The thing is that because I existed in that space and I continue to exist in that space and I was successful in that space, if I'm not critical and intentional, then I can perpetuate, maintain, and enact those same conforming behaviors that I saw harm so many other students. And so I think the frameworks of culturally relevant, culturally responsive, and culturally sustaining pedagogies offer a good foundation for enacting this kind of work. And with all of these frameworks, what I believe the common theme is, it's about the philosophies, not the practices. Um, in talking about culturally relevant teaching and culturally responsive pedagogy, Gloria Latson-Billings says that it's a philosophical outlook that, someone can't give you culturally responsive lessons and say, okay, teach these. It can't be something that's packaged and then you go and do it and all of a sudden you're implementing culturally relevant teaching. It requires, as she says at the bottom here, thoughtfulness and planning. One of her mantras is that we teach what we value. And Django Paris and Sami Alim, whenever they extended her theory of culturally responsive pedagogy into culturally sustaining pedagogies, and they say we sustain what we love. And so my question is, how does your curriculum reflect what you love and value? And how does your curriculum reflect what your students love and value? And we're all at different paths on this journey. We're on different paths at different points in those paths. Some of us might need to re-examine our core values. Some of us might need to think about, wait, what do I value? Because that's going to influence what I teach. And then some of us might also need to reevaluate, is what we're teaching and the practices that we're implementing, do they adequately reflect what we say that we value, what we claim to value, and what we know that our students value? A general question I think that it all boils down to is, what is the purpose of a language education? Who do we really want our students to be as we think about their roles as community and global citizens? I'm going to show you a number, less than 1%. So although roughly 18% of the US population reports speaking a second language, and that's compared to 26% in Canada and 54% in Europe, just to give you a comparison there. Less than 1% of American adults are proficient in the language that they studied in a US classroom, less than 1%. And so if proficiency is our only goal, then we have a very serious disconnect here, right? And so again, I come back to that question: what is the purpose of a language education? It can't be all about proficiency, because if it is, then there's a huge disconnect, and we're not making that work. So if we examine this question within the reality of language education in the United States, how might it change the way that we approach instruction? For me, thinking about it in that realistic, bigger picture, and thinking about the 45 students that I currently have in my Spanish 201 class, right, which is a third semester course, it gives me the freedom to participate in more liberating practices when I think about the general goal of a language education and the potential of a language education outside of just words. And I think we're at a place now where we often think about social justice oriented instruction as incorporating difficult topics and critically examining systems of oppression that rose from centuries of colonization and imperialism. And I think that is important and that is necessary. However, it's not enough. We also need to think about how are we incorporating things of liberation and empowerment in our curriculum. Um, for example, I don't want my students to just learn why white supremacy is bad, okay? Or to look at how white supremacy affects our everyday lives. I want my Black and Brown students to experience empowerment and liberation through the curriculum. And to see themselves and their experiences as integral, authoritative voices in the curriculum, and not just catching glimpses of themselves in an otherwise Eurocentric curriculum. And I think a good resource, a good recent resource for thinking through what that might look like in various contexts and in various ways is Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive, where she says the ultimate goal of abolitionist teaching is indeed freedom. And so I just want to leave you with two quick considerations as I sign off here in a second. And I think these two things have a profound impact on what we teach and how we teach. Essential questions and resource selection. So with essential questions, when we think about language functions, what we want our students to be able to do with the language, here's an example of how we might frame an essential question that will allow us to incorporate more of these things into our lessons at the planning stage, because like I said, it has to be intentional, it has to happen at the planning stage. So for example, if a language function is describing myself and others, or talking about the present, an essential question might be, how do we construct and perform our individual and social identities? And that opens up the conversation and the curriculum to explore, for example, intersectionality, racial justice, daily activism, and allyship. And notice that I say racial justice here and not just racism, because I want to go beyond the oppression. I don't want to stop at the oppression. I want to focus on the liberation. And I have another example here as well. What are the, thinking about discussing the past, what are the motivations and outcomes of our life trajectories across geography and time? So looking at immigrant rights and family and cultural histories. And these are essential questions that I use in my own courses, actually. And then finally, thinking about resource selection. How are we incorporating counterpoint and counter narratives in our resource selection and curricular choices? Thinking about how we incorporate the voices of people who speak the languages that we're teaching and use resources that don't oversimplify diversity or gloss over controversy and inequality. And then finally, where are we looking? And I have here some practical places where I go to find those resources of people who are, sort of speaking their unfiltered truths. So blogs are a good place to go. Twitter, obviously. Specialized community groups, for example, ACTFL-SIGs and Facebook. I just got a great, found a great resource on the Afro-Latin Facebook group just yesterday, actually. Podcasts, your own students. If I have students who are artists, who are writers, poets, I find that out very early through the pre-course survey that we do, and then I reach out to those students to see what they're writing about, what they're thinking about, what they're producing, and figure out, is there a way that I could incorporate this into my class so that we can engage with the students' artistic production as a class community. And I've had really great results with that. And then finally, your own research. What are you consuming? Are you consuming the perspectives of traditionally marginalized groups? And what are you feeding yourself? So to just think critically about that. And here are some resources that have informed my own instructional design. And I'll share this slide with you in the resource page on Scope, and you'll be able to click and get more information. Most of these are contemporary. Some of them are foundational. Like I have Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for example. And then finally, what are the outcomes? I want to encourage you with some student voices. So in my class, like I said earlier, proficiency can't be the only goal. Yes, students learn some Spanish along the way, but their proficiency in Spanish is not what they're going to remember about the course. In this quote, the student says that she's going to incorporate it into her other Spanish classes and just in life in general. So this is something that's going to be embedded into the student's lifestyle. And then this is a Black male student. He says it was nice to see some issues that I deal with as a diverse student brought to the attentions of my white pupils. And with this student in particular, he also mentioned that this was the first time that he saw issues relating to Black identity as being an integral piece of the curriculum and not just an add-on or a special unit. And he wrote this as a senior, you know. And so I just want to end by saying I've learned so much from the people in this photo. This is the actual critical social justice approaches SIG, and from so many others. And I look forward to engaging with you in this important work. And I do thank you for reflecting with me for this brief time. And I look forward to hearing what Krishana and Stacy have to say. That being said, I'm going to pass it over to Krishana now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen here. Thank you, LJ. That was a great setup for what we're going to be sharing. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, Krishana, looks great.
Okay, I'm going to advance one slide just to make sure we're also able to advance. Yep. Can you see the advancing slides?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Krishana Hines Gaither. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I've already been introduced by the great Bobby Hobgood, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So I want to start with this quote from Mark Chesler of the University of Michigan. And he says, many faculty are no more prepared for the increasing diversity of the academy than our students. And everyone's skill and attitude gaps can create a climate difficult for learning. So I want to bring that out because oftentimes we have what is termed a deficit approach, wherein that we put that entire onus on the student for what happens in the classroom space. But there's truly a co-construction of what happens in our classrooms, especially as it relates to these challenging moments and difficult topics and times that we're living in. And so I applaud everyone for being here today to gain some of these skills to fill that gap. I also just want to throw out a few resources here because self-work is very important when we're doing social justice work or managing difficult dialogues. And so Glenn Singleton, this is the 2005 edition of the book on your screen, but there is a 2015 edition. He says that educators need to address their own racial attitudes. And that goes back to what LJ was saying, that there is work that may need to happen before we start engaging in these topics in the classroom. Robin DiAngelo says white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. And so I want to put that out there for us to just self-monitor, self-assess. And then Dr. Amanda Kemp says she did an exercise where she actually looked at what are the negative stereotypes that she has internalized about her own people who are African Americans. And so there's a lot of work to be done on the ground in terms of self-work. So next, I wanted to bring in a few of my students. And so what is happening is affecting our students. We may not be seeing some of them right now because it's summer, but they're deeply affected by what's happening. And so how do we make our classrooms relevant in terms of what we see and what's happening around us? And so one of my seniors, she said, my senior year has been shit, pardon the language. She says, sorry to cuss, but yeah. And then another student, Afro-Latina student, is saying that I have to go and on job interviews and pretend that everything is normal within the context of police brutality and other issues. And then one of my other students who survived apartheid South Africa and escaped from South Africa, some of you may have read in school the book, The Coffer Boy from South Africa, and that was her brother who wrote that book. But Miriam contacted me and said, I'm struggling with this more now than ever. And so I just want to bring this out to put it in context because our students truly are struggling. I'll also, this was on on social media, and I saw this. Many people are trying to address racism right now. And McSweeney's had this kind of satirical post that says, "We condemn all institutional racism except for our own." I've been in the foreign language profession for a long time, and I'm often the first or one of few African Americans in our professional spaces and professional organizations. And I just want to be very transparent and say I have experienced racism in every one of those organizations at every level that they exist. And so I don't want to pretend that we don't have issues within our own profession. And so, and I don't know that as a profession, we've ever truly done a collective work to deal with those issues that we have. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that maybe we're getting there, we're progressing, but I do just want to name that as a tension that I sit with as a member of our profession. And so part of this historical racism that we do experience within our profession, the data clearly shows it. And so when we look at who's getting degrees in languages and how are they being conferred, we also have to look below the numbers. And so it's very clear that of the 17,000 degrees conferred, most of those, over 10,000, go to white people. And then you can see the numbers go down from there. And so, but we have to look deeper than the numbers and say who has been encouraged to continue with language, who has been mentored with languages, who is afforded the opportunities to study abroad, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves to get the right answers. I wanted to just bring in this book, Learning in a Burning House, because I think when we don't deal with what's happening around us, we're simultaneously asking our students to learn essentially in a burning house without addressing the issues that are happening around them. So I want to bring in the 4 stages of intergroup dialogue for those who may be planning to address some of these concerns. I think the University of Michigan, they have a very good model. And so their first stage is building relationships. And you know, of course, may not be able to go through all of these stages in your classrooms, but because sometimes things happen very spontaneously. When all seeds are sown, their first stage is to build relationships, and then to discuss the nature of social identity, such as power, privilege, oppression, and then get to the 3rd stage, which is the hot topic, and then some action planning or alliance building. The action planning may not be that they're going to start a movement. It may simply be that they're going to do more self-reflective work, more research, more study, et cetera. They also offer the anatomy of difficult dialogues, where you start with a warm-up and then you hit your action or your hot topic, and then there's some closure that happens. And again, just someone who's a very seasoned practitioner with a lot of these dialogues, you won't always be able to get to all of these steps, but it's a good model and framework to have in mind. Next, I really lean to NEP, and NEP says, students need the co-creation of a classroom code. And so I do believe, kind of like LJ said, that we do need to access our students as resources. And so one of the tools that I give to teachers who may not be as used to having these types of conversations is to simply survey your students and ask some of the questions that I have here on the screen. I am engaged when we discuss what. I hope to gain X from these discussions. I'm interested in discussing what. You may not follow what your students give you to the letter, but it may be useful information for how you want to frame the content that you're going to have in your classrooms. So what in the world? We have a lot happening right now in terms of pandemics. Some people have phrased it as 2 pandemics with the coronavirus or COVID-19 and also the pandemic of racism. And so we have to look at this from a global perspective. And I think as world language educators, we're in a prime position to be able to do that. And so here, thinking of intersectionality and how do these movements intersect? And so we have Black Lives Matter engagement and protests that are happening all over the world. And so making our students aware of this, that this is not just a US phenomenon, but what is happening globally, I think has real relevance for the world language classroom. And then what do you do with this? What do you do with these intersecting movements that are happening around the world? And so on a really kind of basic level, they can map this out. And I tried to kind of think of some examples for people who teach lower levels, because I think if you teach higher levels, you have, you're thinking of many more options. But for lower levels, it can simply be mapping things out in terms of the distinctions. What does race relations, what do they look like in the US versus Brazil, for example? And then what are the commonalities that they face? This could be something that's really kind of lower level that could be done in the target language or not, depending upon your pedagogy. I wanted to bring in a book by a wonderful scholar, Melva Lode Gooden. She's a Afro-Panamanian scholar. You'd be hard pressed to meet anyone who studies Afro-Panama and they don't know Melva Lode Gooden. And so she actually went through and started collecting data on the different billboards that were up in Panama. And so, and this book is also published in English, by the way, so you can find it in English or Spanish. But this is one of the billboards that was all over Panama, and it says, "To prevent crime, call the police." And you can look at the image of who's represented as the criminal, who's represented as the police. And she started a campaign in Panama to have all of those billboards removed, and she was successful. But even though they were removed, we have to look at what is the history that's happening in Panama that would cause this to even be something that occurs in the millennial era. And so this is not a US phenomenon, but this certainly has global reach. I wanted to bring out just a French language publication for those who want first, L1 resources. And so Observation Société from France, a publication there, they did a study or a survey, I should say, and asked their readers, did they think that it was time to have a vigorous fight against racism in France? And interestingly, about half of them said absolutely, yes. And then the numbers go down from there. But interesting to look at the way that the French responded to this survey about racism. Another resource that I really like is Afrofeminas, which is a great publication, kind of an online magazine, where they look at intersectionality and how do issues that affect Black and Brown people throughout the world, how do they intersect? And that's also a Spanish language publication. And so here, another comparison, in France, you have Adama Traore, which a lot of you probably have looked at, but he was killed very similarly, almost the exact same way as George Floyd, very, very similar. And so interesting to have students to look at those two cases and look at the comparisons between them. Also, just some data here. In France, Arab and Black men are 20 times more likely to be stopped by police. In the UK, Blacks are 10 times as likely to be stopped and searched. And in the United States, according to the Pew Research Center, Black adults report that they are 5 times more likely to be unfairly stopped by police. Again, a global problem. I was recently at a Black Lives Matter protests, kind of on the sidelines because I'm still social distancing, but I was downtown Greensboro, and I was really struck by the amount of art that was happening in the midst of everything that's going on. And so I think as a language educator, it'd be really interesting to bring art into the classroom and see how students may express what they're feeling through art. The classroom as a canvas, I would recommend that there perhaps be a place in your classrooms where students can use it as a canvas. It may be words or it may be images where they can simply tell how they're feeling that day, what's on their minds, a power statement, an affirmation statement. They may respond to a question that you have. It would be a great activity for them to work on in the target language. But share that co-creation of space so that it's not just the educator space, but also the student space as well. Socially conscious rap or socially conscious music. I think it's really powerful when there's multiple points of engagement and ways that we can engage with these topics. And so I offer a few on the screen. I'll highlight Las Crudas. Las Crudas, who are friends of mine from Cuba. I met them about 15 years ago in Cuba, pretty well-known, socially conscious rappers. And they have songs like No Somos Iguales, We Are Not Equal, No Me Dejaron. They wouldn't allow me to go into Spain, an immigration protest song, and Me Rebelo. I think Me Rebelo, I Rebel, is very important because like LJ says, you don't want to just present Black and brown people from a point of oppression, but also from a liberation perspective as well. And Me Rebelo does that really well. I like to include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's in 500 languages, and then assess what's happening on the ground in relation to that document. So I have number 5, Article 5 here. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And so I offer that as, you know, and then we can assess how are we doing with that declaration. For time's sake, I'll move on, but I use that a lot in my classes. And then poetry is something else that I use a lot. And for lower levels, I may just use this poem is about 3 stanzas. I may just use 1 stanza or just a few lines because I think everyone should have exposure to poetry as well. And then in all things balance. And so I say, no one wants to discuss oppression all the time. We all, just like you all turn your TVs off sometimes, we have to also be mindful in terms of balancing this for our students as well. They can't live in a bubble. They must know what's happening around them. But at the same time, we want to make sure that things are balanced and that they're getting liberation and oppressive perspectives of oppression at the same time, and that we're making the conversation accessible to them, either in English or that we give them the linguistic resources that they need for it to happen in the target language. So I want to say thank you, and now I will turn it over to my colleague Stacy.
Thank you, Krishana. Let me share my screen. I'm also going to try advancing a slide just to make sure it's all working properly. Is that?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, so I am Stacy Johnson, and if you want to reach out to me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is on the screen. I would love to continue this conversation out in public where lots of people can join in. My section is about thinking critically, and there's about 100 directions this presentation could go in. And so here's our plan. There's so many books about critical thinking and critical reflection and how the brain engages with some of these more difficult topics. So much research, so much we know. And so I had to really narrow it down to something that could fit into a 15-minute segment. So we're going to talk about thinking clearly. A lot of times when we ask students or when we ourselves engage in really, really challenging conversations, our body has some mechanisms that keep us from really thinking clearly. And so how can we make sure that we and our students are thinking as clearly as possible? How can we make sure that we're all reflecting critically? LJ talked about curriculum development, and Krishana talked about specific elements that you might want to include, or that you'll definitely want to include in your instruction to make sure you're having these difficult conversations. But how can we ask students to critically reflect on what we're presenting them and what they're bringing to the classroom and what that means, make meaning from it? And I think all of this boils down to incorporating consistent learning routines that gives students tools for thinking and reflecting. This also takes some of the day-to-day burden for planning for this type of learning off of us as the instructor if we have built some consistent critical thinking and critical reflection routines into our courses. And to be honest, what we're going to talk about today will help no matter what you're teaching. It's good practice for a lot of reasons, but specifically, if you're going to be talking to students about world challenges, about oppressions, about police brutality, if you're going to be having courageous conversations in your classroom, These sorts of things are going to set that good foundation. So let's start with thinking. And there's two parts of the brain that I'm going to focus on. I am not a neuroscientist. I am an educational researcher, and I don't expect you to be a neuroscientist either. But as educators, we have to have a little bit of understanding of what's actually happening when our students think about these challenging topics. So the two parts of the brain we're going to focus on are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Here's just a visual. So do you see this purple part in front? This is the prefrontal cortex part of the brain. This is the most sort of highly evolved part of our brain. It's also the part of the brain that takes the longest to develop. So until you're in your mid-20s, your prefrontal cortex isn't completely developed, which is interesting because it means if you're teaching any age student up through traditional college age students, your students have not fully developed their prefrontal cortex. And a lot of what we're asking them to do is about using that prefrontal cortex to really examine difficult topics. Now, one interesting thing about the prefrontal cortex that I want to make sure you know is that language production, meaning speaking and writing, are both centered here. They both happen here. So we process sensory experience and language comprehension in different parts of our brain, but all of that sensory experience and language is combined and acted on here to produce language. Executive functions that determine how much self-control we have, all here. Our ability to think and reason through and evaluate other people's intentions in a conversation, it all happens in the prefrontal cortex. If you have an MRI on your brain, this is the part of the brain that is absolutely going to light up when you're having social interactions. Any kind of a social interaction, anytime you're in a conversation with another person, it's centered in your prefrontal cortex. Okay, so healthy people use their prefrontal cortex for all sorts of social, active, and learning activities. The funny thing is the prefrontal cortex also seems to be the most affected by stress. This is going to be important in a minute. So the amygdala, and you can see the diagram is pointing to this little sort of kernel at the center in the base of your brain. The amygdala is a tiny little almond-shaped piece of your brain. It's sometimes called the primitive brain. This is what is responsible for your fight or flight response to threats. So all of us at one time or another experience a threat or a panic that makes us have that familiar feeling of fight or flight. You might freeze up in those situations. You might get the heck out of there. You might be one of those people who's, gets your shoulders up and gets ready for a fight. That's all handled by your amygdala. When the amygdala is activated, it floods your body with stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. It effectively shuts down activity in your prefrontal cortex and says, I got this. You hang out. We don't need a prefrontal cortex right now. I will take things from here. So there's a pretty well-known phenomenon called amygdala hijack. And that is when, for various reasons, the amygdala is super overactive. And even when there's no actual threat, the amygdala is taking over, shutting down the prefrontal cortex. So shutting down language production, shutting down the ability to think clearly, to judge other people's intentions, shutting down everything that makes social interactions possible. And the amygdala takes over and tells you this is a threat and you need to prepare for it. When someone's body is full of adrenaline and cortisol, their prefrontal cortex has taken a back seat, and their amygdala has taken over, we can't have courageous conversations. We just can't. It's not possible for our students to be able to think through the challenging topics we're presenting for them if they find themselves in a situation where they perceive a threat. So how can we keep that prefrontal cortex in charge? Well, there's a lot we know about that as well. Trust is one of the most important things. There's a lot of research on this. So there's one study that in young children, when their mother is near, they don't experience an amygdala response to negative emotions. So let's say the child's alone in a room, they see a very negative experience, their amygdala takes over. However, if the mother is sitting next to them, their amygdala does not take over. Very interesting, right? Having a trusted companion nearby prevents your amygdala from taking over. There's been studies with adults that pretty much show the same thing, that if your significant other or another trusted companion is with you when you have the negative experience, your prefrontal cortex stays in charge. Your amygdala does not take over. Another thing that helps is focusing on sensory experience. So senses are processed all over the brain. So if our students are focusing on what they see, what they hear, what they can feel, what they can smell, what they can taste, it's very difficult for that amygdala to take over. Consciously focusing on sensory experience, in essence, puts the brain back in charge. Another thing that helps is just understanding and acknowledging these emotions. A fight or flight response can be a little scary for the person who's having it. They genuinely feel panicked and like they're going to need to fight their way out or get out of there. And so just taking a moment to acknowledge, this is what I'm feeling right now. I recognize where that's coming from. That can be helpful as well. Puts your prefrontal cortex back in the reasoning position. And finally, movement. Movement works a little differently than all the others, though. The research shows that, for instance, if you're having this amygdala-fueled fight or flight response and you go for a run, it doesn't actually turn down your amygdala, but it does turn on your prefrontal cortex. So it allows you to reason through the strong panic or fear response, which I think is really interesting. Anything that we can do to help students get back into their prefrontal cortex is useful, though. You guys might already have a sense that you're doing a lot of this stuff in your classrooms. Reflecting critically is an extension of this. When students are in their prefrontal cortex, that's a prerequisite. They can't be in a panic state. They can't be in fight or flight. Are we giving students opportunities to observe, connect, and really make meaning from their experiences? Y'all, language teachers are all about making meaning. We ask students to make meaning constantly in our classrooms about how form interacts with meaning and how images can have meaning and how putting different chunks of language together in different ways can create meaning. It's a meaning-filled place, but a lot of times we don't get past meaning on the word level to making meaning of experiences at a higher level. So what do I mean by reflecting critically? The University of Waterloo has a really interesting page about critically reflecting. And one of the things they say is it is a process of identifying, questioning, and assessing our deeply held assumptions. I like to say, I'm going to step out and be myself for a sec. I like to say that it's asking students to wonder if the way their mama taught them to do something might not be the only way to do it. The way you've gone through the world your whole life, being you and interpreting reality and a successful person. Maybe there are other people who are having those same experiences, but from very different places, very different assumptions. And so how can we identify and question what the assumptions are that we hold, and how can we connect that to what we're learning in class? Assumptions about knowledge, about the way we perceive events and issues, our beliefs, feelings, and actions. When you reflect critically, you use what we're learning in class to examine your own biases, to compare theories with action, to search for causes and triggers, and to identify problems at their core. Okay, consistent routines. This is the big one. How do we take what we know about the brain and this desire to keep students thinking clearly, engage them in critical reflection? How do we create consistent routines that actually sort of bake in those processes into our pedagogy? And these are things you can do at a really structural level in your classroom. And from my interaction with teachers on podcasts or on social media or just in the teachers that I get to visit with, I know a lot of us are already doing some of these things. And there's a lot of resources where we can reach out to each other and get some help, get some ideas. I would also say that the idea of creating consistent learning routines in your classroom is that you, as the teacher, are a guide. And your job is to create a clear learning path for your students. If you walk your students through what they need to learn, but don't also create those clear expectations for how they need to engage with the what, we're really leaving a lot up to the student's brain and maybe not facilitating learning as effectively as we could. So how are we creating learning paths? One really big sort of underutilized tool for all ages is play. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about having those hard conversations through play, although that is certainly possible. Those conversations might need to be more serious, though. However, having a classroom where play is a consistent piece of the puzzle, a consistent step in your learning path, what we know about play is really, really convincing. It reduces stress. It literally reduces the level of adrenaline and cortisol in your body. It activates the prefrontal cortex. It is impossible to play without lighting up that prefrontal cortex. It increases trust and social bonds. So we have a real problem in our country, and there's a lot of research. I'm going to post some of the links to this research that I'm citing to, even though I'm not going to cite all of it right now. Later in the materials that I'm going to make available, I'm going to make sure to post links to these things so you can see them. We have a real problem in our country, I think not just in our country, in education in general, with certain minoritized students losing trust in the institutions and in the teachers who are educating them. This is very well documented. In fact, there's some studies that show that if Black or Latinx students lose trust in their educational institutions by 7th grade, they're very unlikely to go on to university. That is troubling. So what am I personally doing to increase trust and social bonds? Do all of the students in my classroom believe that I am a trustworthy teacher? How am I telling them what I'm going to do and then living up to that? And how am I showing myself to be trustworthy and someone that they can confide in and believe has their best interests at heart? Play helps with that. Play also helps the brain build new synapses much, much faster than through traditional learning activities. You get a big bonus from play if it's active or movement based, because exercise actually lights up parts of the brain as well that we want lit up. You get another big bonus if it's free play or free inquiry and not guided by an adult. Guided by an adult play is all right as well, but if it can be done in social groups that are led by students, that's actually a bonus. A really interesting quote I wanted to share is, the function of play is to build pro-social brains that know how to interact with others in positive ways. This is what I was talking about earlier, that these things are going to help you no matter what kind of classroom you have. In a language classroom, what do we need more than a pro-social brain that knows how to act with others in positive ways? However, if you're going to be having these courageous conversations in your classroom, you need this even more. Some examples, and I have a ton of blogs and websites and podcasts that I'm going to include in my handout afterwards. But, language games where you're actually using the target language and the point of the game is learning. Team-based activities where students are working in small social groups to accomplish tasks. Brain breaks, which have been all the rage for a couple of years and are actually hugely beneficial. And when you ask students to respond with movement rather than words, one off the top of my head is like maybe a 4 corners activity, where you have students, instead of saying whether they do something, you have them stand up and move to the part of, one of the 4 corners of the room. Just that simple addition of movement adds some lightheartedness and some play elements that are great for lighting up that prefrontal cortex. Another really important one is mindfulness. Remember I said focusing student attention on sensory experience activates the prefrontal cortex. It reduces stress. It also has been shown to reduce amygdala activity long term. So students that are experiencing chronic stress, mindfulness actually helps reduce that. Some examples that I wanted to share with you of mindfulness that I've personally seen in classrooms. I saw a teacher of Hindi who spent the first 3 to 4 minutes of class teaching a new yoga pose, which had some mindfulness embedded in it. I've seen or teachers include moments of breathing or centering to start class. Also, a learning activity could be a guided meditation. People like Julie Spano and Justin Slocum Bailey post things on the internet for teachers, and so I'm going to share some links to some great activities with y'all. And then finally, the last one I wanted to share is structured reflection. There's a really great article in Foreign Language Annals that just came out a couple months ago by Corey Crane that talks about how to integrate structured reflection into your class, some approaches to doing that. How often are you going to do structured reflection varies widely from daily to weekly to 4 times during a semester. So you'll have to decide what works for you. But it's really important when you use structured reflection to ask students things that are not just reflecting on their learning experience, like what did I learn and how did I learn it, but are asking them to critically reflect, identifying triggers, like did anything in this unit shock or surprise you? When did you feel excited? When did you feel uncomfortable? And to help them integrate their learning. So have you been able to make any connections between what we're learning and your life outside? How will you take action or learn more? So play, mindfulness, and structured reflection are 3 really great tools that all of us have at our disposal right now and that we can start using consistently. But I'm curious, how are you going to build what LJ, Krishana, and I have talked about in this webinar into your consistent lesson planning to create a critically reflective learning path for your students? Thank you so much.
So many thanks to our 3 presenters. Folks, I know if you're anything like me, I'm probably not going to be able to get to sleep tonight very easily because my mind is going to be racing with so many questions and ideas from what we've heard in a relatively short amount of time. As you could see, any one of our panelists could have done a day-long workshop on their presentation topics. With that being said, again, many thanks to all of you. We're going to take some time now. I saw some really interesting questions, some courageous questions that were coming up both in the Zoom Q&A as well as in our YouTube live stream. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Leslie Baldwin, and Leslie's going to field some of these questions to our panelists. Leslie.
Thanks, Bobby, and thank you again also to the panelists. There's just been great comments going on in the chat and in the Q&A, and everybody's been just really, really appreciative of what everyone is sharing. And there are some good questions. I also did just make a note in the chat. I wanted to make sure people saw, because there's been questions about this. All the resources that the presenters have mentioned and the recording of this webinar will be posted at the SCOLT website by the end of the week. So if you want to go back and watch it again, if you need to leave, because now we're at our hour, but we're going to go over a little bit, or if you wanted to share it with others, it'll all be posted at the SCOLT website. I'm going to bring up 2 questions that came up in the Q&A that I think might be on lots of people's minds. One is, how do you have these crucial conversations, especially at the novice level with students? I think participants can see doing this at the intermediate, mid, and intermediate, high level, but what about our novice, our level 1s and 2s? And then also thinking about the environment we are all currently in and might be in August and September. How do we build trust and have play and movement in the online environment? So those are 2 separate questions. I'm not sure how we want our panelists to respond to those, but maybe 1 or 2 of you want to hop in on one of those.
Hey, Leslie, can you hear me a bit better now?
Yes, that is better. Thanks, Stacy.
No problem. I would be really interested to hear from the other two panelists about building these things into the novice classroom. But I will say that I typically do teach novices, and there are 3 ways, which it would take a whole nother webinar to go into detail on all 3, but I'll talk about 2 ways, and specifically that I have some of these harder conversations at that lower level. One is just by representing those experiences in the curriculum. So the textbook that has been chosen for me and the curricular materials that I've been given don't represent the diversity of the Spanish-speaking world. And a lot of times when they are making comparisons between different aspects of the US and different aspects of the target culture, they're choosing really simple things that I think we have the language to actually talk about more complex things. So for example, why would we compare what chores my college students prefer to do? Why would that be something that they need to talk about? Why wouldn't we talk about the types of jobs that are available to young people with or without a college degree in different countries? Why wouldn't we talk about how long people in different countries tend to live with their parents and how that differs across different types of groups, and why those sorts of socially constructed age limits on living with your parents exist? So I think there are things that we can talk about using the language we already have access to. And I think the curriculum materials I've been given just do a really terrible job of picking the right topics. So just by using the same language and the same types of activities, but just choosing a better topic, that's representing the actual diversity of the world, that's really useful. I recently got to read a short paper by a teacher, Mary Hudgens Henderson, who talks about LGBTQ rights in one particular city in the US and how LGBTQ rights were codified in that city, and compares that to a city in Mexico and what LGBTQ rights look like legally in that city. So these are things that we can talk about, like it was done here in this year, it was done here in this year, this happened in this country, this happened in this country. These are actually really simple topics. We could be talking about historical events. She just chose one that really relates to the current socio-political moment. And then the second is one that LJ mentioned, which is choosing counter narratives. When you choose counter narratives, you're saying, here is a short blurb that gives a different perspective to something we're learning. So once again, as someone who has a prescribed textbook I have to use, the textbook usually shows a really sort of superficial sanitized version of some imaginary, monolithic culture out there. And I can say, that's a not a very good look at what people's lives are actually like. So I'm going to bring in a short blurb written by someone from that target culture that uses very similar language, but gives the first-hand account. So yeah, that's my take.
And I agree with all of that. Thanks, Stacey. And just really quickly to add to that, I teach Spanish. And so to help frame discussions about difficult topics, for example, we're talking about racism now, and we're reading a poem by Nicolas Guillen, and students are interacting with that authentic resource. And we're also looking at songs. And so like Krishana mentioned earlier, like simple text, like poetry and songs, those are ways that I help my novice students engage. I help them learn cognates that they'll need to know. And I know that in Spanish, that might be easier than in Japanese or something like that. And then I also give them space for reflection in English, because I know that it's frustrating to want to engage critically in these topics in a way that your current proficiency in the target language just doesn't allow. And so I do allow some space for them to reflect in English. They'll be okay if they do an activity in English every now and then. So.
I was just going to add to the great things that my colleagues have already said, feeding off of what LJ and Stacey said. I think those digestible chunks are really important. And so like Guillen, I use his work a lot because it deals with a lot of social issues, but his poems are also very long, very long. And so for my lower level or novice level students, I may just use a few lines of that poem and maybe a sentence or maybe just one stanza that I feel that they can actually digest. Also, I'll use yes and no questions for novice learners where they may not be able to fully articulate their thoughts and views on these issues, but I can pose a question or a scenario to them using a lot of cognates, fewer words, and then just have them to respond yes or no. Also build on what they already know. And so in novice classrooms, they're oftentimes learning their feelings. And so you can present these topics that are happening or present headlines and then ask them how do they feel about it, because they're able to do that at very low levels. And then finally, self-care. I always, when I'm talking about these tough topics, ask, how are you taking care of yourself? Well, if they've learned their first, the conjugations in the present tense, they can tell you to take care of myself, I read a book. They can tell you I take a walk. They can say I eat chocolate. They can say I go to church. Those are really simple constructs. And so sometimes I'll just use what are we learning, such as those action verbs, and then just relate that to just self-care or something like that.
I think those are all great suggestions and responses to that. Definitely ways to make things accessible at the novice level, but also remembering that 90% plus in the target language is just that. There is time reserved for English as long as it's planned and purposeful, and this might be part of that purposeful plan. Does anybody want to speak to the question around building trust and having activity and play and movement in the online environment?
Yeah, I'll jump in again. I've seen some amazing examples on social media. So if our participants aren't following a ton of teacher blogs through social media, then I would say I'll try and put a few links into my resources. But I saw a great example. I believe it was by our actual Teacher of the Year, Rebecca Bluewolf. I could be wrong. But instead of having students put a yes or no, they stand in front of their camera and do different actions. They use their body to express whether their answer to a question is a yes or a no, which I thought was really interesting. Get them sort of up out of their seat and doing things in front of the camera. I also think that some of my favorite people in the profession are people I met online and mostly collaborate with online. And I think that in 2020, we can do a really good job of getting to know each other online. We have great technology. We have video. We have FaceTime. We have amazing technology. What it takes really is the will to get to know each other, to be vulnerable with each other, and to invest time in listening and trying to understand each other's perspectives. And my take on the research literature about online teaching is that there is many students find the online environment that they have even more access to their professor or teacher, that they feel connected. I have a lot of personal stories from teaching online of students who felt like they were able to represent themselves online in a way that was very authentic and maybe even more authentic than a classroom environment allowed. So as far as building trust, I think it's all the same things that help us build trust face to face. We just have to figure out how to make that mediated by technology.
And I would just add, I just taught an online class in the last semester during COVID-19, and we did a coffee shop. And so the first, couple of days of class, we had each student to actually record themselves in some capacity, though it doesn't have to be recorded. And just we gave them some prompts about, what do you like? What do you hope to get out of this class? What do you do for fun? Tell us something about you that we didn't know before, things like that. And then we had they had to look at 2 or 3 of their classmates' posts and ask them questions and comments. And that was really nice. And I co-taught that class with a professor from India. And we did the same thing. And so I also think in the online environment, if you can bring yourself into it as well, that helps to build that community. So not just asking our students to do those community building activities, but if we engage in that along with them, I think that can be really helpful. And then an activity that I got from the University of Michigan, actually love them, It's called the Culture Box, and you can do that in a simulated activity online where students have to, if you're in a physical space, they would put 3 items that represent them or that impact them or that are meaningful to them, and they would describe those 3 items in a physical space. In an online environment, they can easily do that with slides, and so they're bringing into the space something that's really meaningful to them. And I find the more, Lisa Delpit, one wonderful multiculturalist, says, to teach you, I must know you. And I feel like the more we get to know them, the more trust is built.
Great points. Thank you all. I'm looking at our time, and so I'm gonna pass this on to Heidi for a couple of questions from the YouTube stream. Thank you
All
all.
right. We've had a lot of action going on YouTube as well, and I've compiled a document. So if we don't answer all of these, I will make sure they're shared with the presenters as well. So one of the big questions we were having on YouTube, and I'm trying, there we go, got to my screen so I can see it, was, and I'll give you guys, and whoever wants to answer this one, go for it. So the question was, in what ways can we hold the tension between meeting target language goals and teaching a language that was or is used to colonize and dehumanize Black, Indigenous, and people of color? So whoever wants to jump in.
I think you say everything that you just said, I think it's just like the way I started out, and I can only hope it lands well. And if not, we'll work through it. But I started out my talk by saying, I cannot pretend that we have, a utopia within our world language organizations. I can't pretend that we don't have issues. And so on my syllabus, I have tenets that guide my teaching practice. And one of my tenets is that language has been used to colonize. I use that exact line. So I have like 10 things that you need to know when you enter the classroom that I'm facilitating. And that is one of the lines, that language has historically been used as a tool of dominance and colonization. And I just say that. So I just acknowledge that.
LJ or Stacy, any thoughts? All right.
I want to hear from LJ.
Sorry, I did ditto, and it's funny because I saw Krishana's amazing presentation that she did for the ACTFL SIG, and because of that suggestion that she just mentioned, I too added a paragraph in my syllabus about that, because what I have found, and Krishana mentioned this in her talk, and I was experiencing the same thing, students were surprised that I was bringing these issues into the classroom, and so they just weren't really prepared for that, and so I wanted to be clear from the beginning, we're going to talk about these things, and we feel that with English. I speak English, which is a colonizer's language, and so I took a little bit of time to pull my syllabus up, and the first sentence of that blurb says, Spanish, like many European languages, including English, has a history characterized by centuries of colonization and imperialistic domination. And I talk about how later on in my attempt to flip the narrative, this course will take an intentionally anti-colonial and anti-racist approach. And I talk about what that means through my lens. And so at least they know, at least that's on their minds as we're engaging with the language and the resources.
Awesome. And then one other question that's been really popular on YouTube is the issue of trust and establishing a sense of trust with your students for the difficult conversations, especially when they suspect that the teacher may have different views than the student. They're asking, what suggestions do you all have for establishing trust and creating those difficult conversations?
Well, there was something that I didn't have time to fit into my presentation, but it's sort of a framework that I used to think about trust. And so I think about trust as having 2 different components, or 2 types of trust, really. There's transactional trust and relational trust. So when I go to the bank with my check that I want to cash or deposit, I do not know the teller, and I have no idea whether she's a good listener or whether I can trust her with my secrets or whether I can trust her to babysit my children. I do not have any relational trust with her. However, I trust 100% that if I give her that check, the money will appear in my banking account. I have a transactional trust with her because that bank has set up expectations for me about what should happen when I go there, and they have delivered on it so many times that it just feels like second nature that that's how the system works. And so I want teachers to know that students already have transactional trust with us, whether or not they have relational trust, but that transactional trust might actually be really negative. It might be really dangerous. So they might have heard from lots of teachers, I trust you and I value you, and then actually felt like that trust and value didn't come through. And so the transactional trust that our students might come in with is when teachers say they trust and they value me, what they mean is as long as I conform and get straight A's and do what I'm supposed to, I will get rewarded for that. That's what that means. So there's a level of transactional trust where the institutions we belong to, the people who've come before us have set up expectations, and our students know what that really means, what the hidden meaning of that transaction is. So I think the first step in developing trust is to transactionally deliver. I teach on a semester basis. I don't have my students for long periods of time. So in the first couple weeks of the semester, I like to set up some wacky assignments where I ask my students to do things they're typically not asked to do in college classrooms. And then I say that once they do this thing, I'm going to do this other thing, and then I deliver. So if you interview someone in your family about their language learning experience, you will get 100 on a major test grade for turning that in. It doesn't seem to make sense to them. They haven't had someone engage in that transaction with them before. So I sort of have a blank slate to create some transactional trust. Once I feel like I have their transactional trust, that they know that they can trust me the same way I trust a bank teller, then I start working on the relational trust, which is getting to know each other, showing each other that you value, making your intentions really clear, and then living up to what you've said your intentions are, sort of more of that interpersonal piece. But I start with the lowest common denominator, which is how can I tell you what my philosophy of teaching is, set up assignments and activities in class that live up to that, and then deliver on my end so that you can see I'm not just here to punish you.
I think you covered it, Stacey. That was beautiful.
Heidi, is there any other question, or Leslie, from either of the chat windows that we could end with this evening?
There are several other from the YouTube. Some of them are more specific to individual presenters, and we can put those in the resource document because they were asking for specific resource links. But I'm just looking again to see if there's any that would be a good summary. I think we've pretty much hit most of the YouTube ones except for those specifics.
I think we've covered the general questions. I will, and I'll put this link in the chat as well. But we have created a question and answer document to be able to answer some of these questions that we don't have time to get to all in today, and that's posted on our suggested resources for social justice and education page at the SCOLT website. So I'll put that link in the chat right now. But anyone can enter a question, and our panelists have agreed to go in and enter some answers later. So there were a couple of questions that came up that I've already added there. And I think we can share that and continue the conversation in that way.
Yeah, and I would also say just continue the conversation on Twitter as well. It's been very, very active, like super active tonight. So keep it going. It doesn't stop here.
Absolutely. And Heidi, with that being said, you know, these kinds of conversations, these courageous conversations, these critical, hard conversations are the types of conversations that we can only improve upon by engaging in them. I can recall a pre-service teacher asking me once, how do you have tough conversations with students? How do you talk about this and that? And I said, you know, I could give you a bulleted list, but the best way is through practice, through doing this. So I want to thank, on behalf of the Southern Conference on Language Teaching, our panelists for helping us to really think about how and why we should have such important conversations with our students. This is just the beginning, and I hope that we all will continue this conversation, that, as Heidi mentioned, the conversation does not and should not stop here. We won't be doing ourselves justice. We won't be doing the profession justice if we don't continue to have such conversations. So please, everyone, join me in a virtual round of applause and thanking LJ Randolph, Krishana Hines Gaither, and Stacy Margarita Johnson for their fantastic insight into some very challenging but very important topics this evening. Before we finish, I want to remind you of a few logistics. And so I'm going to try to share my screen this time in hopes that I'll do it correctly. So we'll see if this works here. As we mentioned to you throughout the presentation, our presenters have so graciously agreed to, number one, provide additional resources and content that they maybe briefly shared during their slides. We'll make that available on the SCOLT website on a page that you see here. And so we'll be sure to link this prominently from the homepage, in addition to the archive recording of this event. Further, there were a number of questions that maybe were not answered, as Heidi and Leslie indicated, very specific sorts of questions. And again, our presenters have graciously agreed to respond to those questions as well. And so that information will be shared with everyone via the SCOLT website. Again, the archive recording and the link to those resources will be available from the homepage, that is scolt.org. Give us until about Friday afternoon to make all of that look really nice, and we'll have it ready for you there. We want to remind you of SCOLT's annual conference to be held March the 18th through the 20th in 2021 in Atlanta, Georgia. Our theme is looking at language through an unfiltered lens, and we would love to have your ideas and your thoughts via a proposal to this conference. And you see there the link where you can submit through October the 15th of this year. It is bit.ly/SCOLT, all capital letters, 2021. bit.ly/SCOLT 2021. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you all in Atlanta. Thanks again to Stacy, to Krishana, LJ, and to our question moderators, Leslie and Heidi. Have a good evening.
Thank you, SCOLT. Thank you, panelists.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Thanks.
Of course. We're still live on YouTube, by the way.
I know we're still live on YouTube. So folks on YouTube and the video recording will catch this, and the 70 some odd people who are still in the room. But thanks. Went really well. Super.
Super awesome. Twitter is on fire.
That's great.
Very well.
That's great. Leslie, and thank you both. I was kind of trying to monitor, between my laptops, the Q&A, the chat, the YouTube chat, just a lot.
And the Facebook was going on too. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to monitor all these things.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
Are you going to turn the live stream off now?
So the live stream, I'm going to turn